Okay, hi there, and welcome to this Advent course. I want to give you a little bit of background to why I'm running it, then a little bit of, I want to chat a little bit about what I mean by contradiction and a logic of the Incarnation, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. So this was not originally an Advent course. A church run by a friend of mine in Florida reached out to me and said, Pete, would you do a course on something? Because the COVID era, you record some talks, do something with our community. And I thought, well, I suppose I could do that because I could do it for you. And then I could also do that with the people on Patreon. And so I decided to do something on this notion of contradiction and how it plays out in very concrete ways in religious life. And then I put it off till January to do it with you guys. And just a few days ago, I was sitting there and I was like, no, this is perfect for Advent. This is an Advent course, right? So it's a 4-week course. It was originally 3, but add in another week, 4-week course. I know Advent is 4 weeks because I have my Ginvent calendar that comes every month or every year, not every month. And basically, Incarnation is all about a kind of contradiction. It's what the philosopher Hegel calls the monstrosity of Christ, right? There's a monstrosity. There is this weird thing of the eternal and the temporal, the infinite and the finite being brought together in this figure of an individual. So that's what this is going to be about. We're going to explore this notion of contradiction and how it relates to this story of Christmas. And I love the term monstrous because it's so kind of aggressive. When we think of Christmas, we don't think that we're awaiting the arrival of a monster. It makes Christmas into a kind of a horror story, right? This Advent is a preparation for this monstrous arrival of this God person, this God-Child. And but it kind of that's why I kind of like the term, because it kind of catches you a little bit and maybe gives us a sense of actually the controversy of this notion. Like, by calling Christ monstrous, we maybe get beyond the tinsel and get back to going, this is actually a crazy claim, a mad claim, and can we make any sense of it? So that's what we're going to do. So a few things then about this notion of contradiction. So very briefly, in the world of thought and in philosophy, you kind of got two positions. One is that you cannot make sense of contradiction. Contradiction is the end of sense, right? So a square triangle makes no sense, right? Saying that the universe has a beginning and has no beginning, saying those two statements makes no sense. One has to be true or one has to be false, or they can both be false maybe, but they can't both be true. So there is this, and it's a very popular notion, right? Contradiction is when meaning grinds to a halt. And we all know this. If we're in an argument and people make contradictory claims, kind of go like, there's no point in arguing, right? The contradiction means that we can no longer speak rationally together. So there's that position. But then there's also a position in which some philosophers have tried to make sense of contradiction. They actually have tried to argue that there is a form of contradiction that is meaningful, that is very, very important, and is actually central to the world of thought and the world of reality itself. And that's kind of direction we're kind of going to go in. And the name for this is dialectics. So dialectics is the name for a form of thought that operates within contradiction, that flows with contradiction. And it's a very difficult form of thought. It's as old as philosophy itself. But like Plato, for example, said that nobody should be introduced to dialectics before the age of 30, right? Because it's so complicated. You can study all other things, do the arts, poetry, sciences, but until you're 30, no dialectics. So I don't know if anyone's under 30 here, but you can clear off, right? This is not for you. You have to be over 30 to be part of this, according to Plato. And it's because dialectics has a counterintuitive dimension to it and requires a lot of work. So then, just coming to Christianity in particular, early on in Christianity, Tertullian made this really weird claim. He said, I believe in Christ and Christ crucified because it is absurd. Right? So there's this really an interesting phrase that you may have heard, that Tertullian is basically saying the whole idea of Christ and the crucifixion is totally absurd, and that's why I believe in it. And this has caused people a lot of confusion over the years, right? Because the two most popular views on Christianity are either it is absurd, it falls into contradictions, and therefore it's meaningless, it's bad, or Christianity is not absurd. It doesn't fall into contradictions, and therefore it's good or it's meaningful. So apologists often try to show that Christianity does not lead to contradictions and deadlocks and what's called antinomies. But it all actually does make sense. So if you watch someone like William Lane Craig or something like that, he's always attempting to show the reasonableness of religion. So those are the two most common positions. It's absurd, it falls into contradiction, so forget about it. It doesn't, and therefore you can take it seriously. But what I want to look at today and over the next 4 weeks is the idea that Christianity is absurd. And that's what makes it so insightful and so interesting. And that there is something very profound in this notion of absurdity. I use the word absurd, by the way, because absurdity means the clashing together of two opposites. The philosopher Albert Camus, who is the philosopher of the absurd, he defined the absurd as the experience you have when you, as a meaning-desiring being, right? You desire meaning, you desire that there's some purpose to your life and to the universe. When you confront a universe that seems to refuse to give you meaning, that's the experience of the absurd. So for Camus, the absurd isn't one thing or the other. It's the feeling of you want meaning and you can't find it. The universe isn't giving you meaning, and that experience is the experience of the absurd. So it's a type of an experience of the contradiction. And in psychoanalysis, that's called the symptom. The symptom is a coagulation of a contradiction. You've heard me talk about that before. I won't say too much about that. But if you both love your kids and also they drive you mad, right? That's a contradiction. And that contradiction might lead to you getting really angry at your partner and really shouting at them. Because in a sense, you can't shout at your kids, a baby or whatever. The baby has, it's just a child. So you have to take that and it explodes somewhere else. But the symptom speaks of this contradiction that you are living within, a congealment of contradiction. And we try not to admit that we're in contradiction, but we often are. We love the people we hate. We want to speak and want to stay silent. We have all of these kind of like mixed emotions and feelings, and symptoms are often what's called a compromise formation. A symptom is the eruption of a way of trying to get these two to be together. So, okay, that's the absurd. So Tertullian talks about Christianity being absurd. Soren Kierkegaard very famously does too. He might come up in this course a little bit. And the philosopher Hegel is very, very key in that. And for Hegel, who is the philosopher of contradiction, Christianity is particularly interesting. He calls it the true religion, right? It's because he thinks it brings contradiction up to its highest level, right? It brings it right up to this crashing together of the eternal and the temporal, of the infinite and the finite, of God and humanity. And on the cross, this kind of death of God, that which cannot die, dying, right? These are all monstrous contradictions that are happening within Christianity. And Hegel felt that this was, for him, the best representation of the nature of reality itself before he gets to philosophy, because he liked philosophy even more. But he said Christianity kind of gets there in a pictorial form and philosophy gets there in an intellectual form. And one other thing about dialectics, which you'll like this, I think, right, is so dialectics is a form of, you have one position, then it generates an opposite position. And then one way of describing it is the opposite position somehow you see that it actually encompasses its opposite. And then you enter into a third position. And it's always the wrong choice. Whenever dialectics happen, so there's this position, the second position, then you see the second position encompasses the first, and you go to a third position. And it's like this. Example of, you go to a therapist. There is happiness and there is sadness. And you want to choose happiness. But actually, through counseling, you have to go into the sadness. You have to make the wrong choice, right? The last thing you want to do, right, is to actually enter more deeply into your sadness. In fact, that's why you're going to the counselor, because you're trying to get rid of that. You're too caught up in it. You want to escape the sadness, the depression. So you're given a choice, light or darkness, and you have to go into the darkness. But then you discover that as you go into the darkness, you find light. As you go into the sadness and as you talk it through and as you reflect on it, that darkness becomes light, and it kind of encompasses what it seems to be the opposite. In religious terms, you get this all the time. You've got two choices, the wide path or the narrow path. So the right choice is the wide path, but it's not. You have to choose the wrong path, the narrow path. The narrow path being then the right path. You've got life or death. What do you choose? Well, of course, you choose life, not death, but not in dialectics. You choose death, and in death, you find life. Like, like the idea of giving yourself wholly to someone and losing yourself for someone else is paradoxically the way that you can feel most alive and most human, is precisely in the moment that you lose yourself. This is kind of dialectics. Whereas naturally, when we're confronted with two positions, we want to choose the best. Dialectics is always this choosing of the worst. And in choosing the worst, and the worst actually showing us something deep. And this is exactly what you see in the Incarnation. It's dialectic, right? God and the human together. But where are they together? They're not together in God. They're together in the human. It's not that we're risen to the level of God. The story of Christmas is the story of God and human being brought together in the wrong way, in the human, in the most fragile of things, an infant, a child. And somehow that wrong choice is the right choice. So that's the logic. And you're actually going to see the point of this course is not so much me talking about it like this. I wanted to kind of give you an overview, but it's to actually see how it works out. And I chose 3 different things before we get to the actual Christmas narrative. One is how it plays out in religious forms of knowing, how it plays out in desire, and then how it plays out in faith. And so today was all about how this kind of plays out in knowledge. So hopefully you kind of you listen to the reading, you watch the video. Very briefly, what I was trying to say was, especially with Paul Tillich, and I use C.S. Lewis because he's a good Belfast guy. I grew up just around the corner from him. And I have his festival every year, this retreat, which is in the hotel where he had his honeymoon with joy and where he would write. And it's very magical. And it's just on the back of the hotel is a forest that inspired Narnia. And it is like walking through Narnia. So I loved it. Sadly, I can't do it because I'm at COVID time, but we'll get back to doing Spark. But so I always like C.S. Lewis. I think he's done an injustice by the people who think he's unspeakably good and unspeakably bad. Like most people, he's somewhere in the middle. He's a very smart and interesting writer who says some interesting things. So I kind of wanted to start off with him, but I jumped in especially to Paul Tillich. And what you'll have hopefully got from the talk that I gave is that for Tillich, the not having truth, the sense that you're always missing truth, is actually being within the truth. The person who is always trying to be just and is never able to be just. So they're a lawyer and they're always trying to rectify the law to make it more just, but never quite gets there. That is evidence of being within justice. When I argue with you about the truth, and you say there is no truth and I say there's truth, the very fact that we can argue together shows that we are immersed in something called truth, but we can't grasp it. We are grasped by it. So weirdly, and I think I referenced the Bible verse, seek ye and you shall find, knock and the door will be open, ask and you will receive. In the talks we were doing yesterday, I mentioned how the first time we read this, we always kind of read it wrong. We think that we knock and then we wait and then the door is opened. You know, we seek and eventually we find, just like if I lose my keys, I look and then I find them. But actually the verse then is saying something much more profound. It's saying seeking is finding. Knocking the door is the door opening, and seeking is finding. So the very heartfelt desire to find the truth shows that in some way that not having the truth is an expression of standing within the truth. Okay, so now I want to open it up for the next 45 minutes just to kind of have conversation and chats. So does anybody want to draw out anything from the talk or what I've just said about the logic of incarnation? We'll start there. Who's brave enough to kick us off?
I'll start if no one else will.
Great.
Pete, I was fascinated by what you were saying was the difference between enjoyment and contemplation, and how you kind of are either really in the moment experiencing it, not necessarily enjoying, but actually in the experience, or you're separate from it. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's very easy to see kind of in practice in day-to-day life, people who kind of love to live in one space or another. How do you think we can work on getting the right balance so that we're not either sitting outside of everything all the time, kind of judging and everything else, or always being inside it and getting the balance?
Yeah, no, that's very good. And it is a beautiful, it's one of C.S. Lewis's most interesting kind of ideas that he borrowed from this philosopher. And, you know, he has been critiqued for it, but it is quite a beautiful way of thinking about things, that you're either immersed in something and you're enjoying it, or you're in some way distanced from it, reflecting on it. And how do these two things come about? Now, as you know from the talk, C.S. Lewis's answer to that was myth. And he thought Christianity was mythological, but he also said it's also true. So he tried to bring together those two things, but because it is something that, well, this is almost what Hegel is saying, is like that in the idea of the incarnation, in this image, in this exploration, you bring together having and not having, enjoyment and contemplation. They're brought to, but you're saying, what does it look like? You're saying like, what does it feel like? Or what is, help me. Yeah, I kind of, it's, because the difference between Lewis and maybe Paul Tillich is C.S. Lewis is almost looking for a balance. Myth kind of gives you a bit of both. And dialectics is weirdly saying that the more you go into contemplation, the more you will find enjoyment. Like there's no middle, it's not a middle ground, it's not a balance, it's like an extreme. So I'm trying to figure out how to describe that.
I was reminded of, with this, of a couple different essays from David Foster Wallace. And one was an early one called How Tracy Austin Broke My Heart. And it's about they're both about tennis player, and he is a writer trying to, like, just being so almost obsessed with trying to understand what makes these athletes. What is the thing that makes them create and be in the, like, this beautiful experience and like this athletic prowess and beauty and competition, etc. So his early one, he's like, well, he eventually gets to a point where, like, okay, I as a writer, Like, I can't read biographies. They don't make any sense. Autobiographies, interviews with tennis players after they play, like it just doesn't do justice to what they just did, the way they're describing it. And then years later, he writes this amazing essay called Roger Federer as a Religious Experience, in which he is watching Roger Federer and has almost come to more of a sense of like, he's the writer who can do this contemplation and is doing it at an extremely high level in this essay, really kind of creating a myth. But that Roger Federer on the court can be in that experience so much that like it doesn't need the contemplation, and it's almost like it's all right. So it's like the two extremes. Most of us don't live in the two extremes though. So it's like, where are we in that continuum or spectra? But it was kind of interesting because one almost keeps you from having the other.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great. Let me feed back part of what I think you were saying, because this is a great answer that I couldn't get to. Is that so? If you, so you're an athlete, yeah, you put in your 10,000 hours and you study it, you get the skills. Like, you have to actually get into the science of it. But then you get to such a point where that's so integrated in you that you're not thinking. In fact, they say that sometimes when an athlete starts to think about what they're doing, a professional athlete, they lose it. And there's a couple of athletes I've heard of who had to go into a type of therapy to kind of stop them from overthinking. So is that the kind of?
Yeah, it's almost like you can't do both at the same time.
Yeah, or
yeah,
the person's gone to such an extreme that they kind of enter into this sounds like dialectics to me. Like, in my work, doing this is interesting to me, right? I've done this type of work for so long that now I can literally turn on the camera and chat. Right? Now, that you go back 10 years, I would have been terrified at that thought, or 15 years, where I always planned out so much. I used to write so many notes for talks. Now, if you probably can't see it, but it's like a little page of just brief jottings that I took down before this. I don't even look at it. But it's because I've done so much of the hard work that now it's kind of in me. And actually, if I did think about it too much, I would lose it. So that might be the idea of, I've gone to the extreme. And like, Kate's a doctor. I bet you see patients now, and all of the study that you've done, it's natural. It's just kind of like you're in it. But the in it isn't a lack of contemplation, a lack of study. It's like you only can get to that level of enjoyment, i.e. integration, because of the study you've done. Am I getting you right?
Yeah, and it fits a lot with this great thing that I kind of discovered once I got into design, is this tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. So like what you're just describing is like, you have built up this tacit knowledge, and like practice of medicine is this tacit knowledge, and then making that explicit is kind of hard for another person. It kind of fits with the story too, in terms of like, it's a knowledge that you use all the time getting through the world, but how do you explain it to someone else who doesn't necessarily have that embodied tacit knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah. Is that a good set of analogies for that, for what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think so. You know me, I'm desperately practical. So as soon as there's any kind of theoretical thing, I'm like, okay, so what does that look like in everyday life? And I know that it can be looked at, like when people are talking about the theory of something versus the practical application of something, it's very easy to feel like you're either doing it or you're talking about it, and trying to work out if there is a way to go into one enough that you kind of can do both at the same time.
There's a beautiful documentary, by the way. A guy, I met him a couple of times, a guy called Tao Rossellini, called Being in the World. And it's a documentary about the work of Heidegger, but it's very, it's all about people who are experts in their field and who don't reflect on what they're doing. They just kind of do it. So they're in pure enjoyment, but their pure enjoyment comes from this kind of mastery of their craft. So that actually might be a really nice documentary if anyone's bored to check out in terms of that Lewis notion of how to bring enjoyment and contemplation together. Yeah.
So isn't this something that Francis struggled with? Like, it wasn't his whole purpose to live on the fringes of society, but also to serve society and to be in the presence of God through contemplation, but also acting out of that contemplation to serve God in the world. And that was kind of his lifelong struggle, right? And teaching is trying to balance those two things, right?
That's very good. Yeah, because that's a great look at, again, contradiction, where on one side you've got mystics, like at an extreme, and the other side materialists. So say the mystic is one who, you know, gets caught up in transcendental experience and kind of detaches from kind of the material world. And so as much as possible, a certain type of mystic wants to kind of connect with that transcendental dimension of subjectivity. And then a materialist might be someone who gives themselves to the material conditions of life and want to see material changes in socioeconomic systems, etc. And the challenge is, what is the point where, and this is what Bonhoeffer does actually in week 3 when we look at Bonhoeffer. He's interesting because he wants to, like the way you're describing, see that a profound materialism as simultaneously a profound mysticism, that by giving oneself wholly to the world, you're somehow engaging with some sort of transcendental dimension. So is that the kind of, yeah, that's definitely an issue.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So hopefully the Bonhoeffer one will be interesting actually to you, because that's very much his, one of his.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It reminds me of whenever Spark was happening 2 years ago, back whenever I came and like my first Spark, you know, and I was sitting here, I'm like, reminds me of the time that I was struggling to write for the longest of time. And I was sitting there, I was like, I can't write. I have no motivation. Like, modern day life is just so stressful. And it's like, just being able to go to something and seeing how to balance the love of writing again, and then coming to Ireland and having a complete different experience, you know, it's a complete like refresh kind of thing, like you were talking to us back then. It was just that, like, mental refresh of how do I balance everyday life with things that bring me joy. And like, I can't explain it to any other person, because I know like certain friends are like, oh, I understand. It's like, but you don't understand. Like, it's kind of that mental refresh of, I need to know how to balance my everyday life with learning how to bring stuff that brings me happiness, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And you're a good advertisement for that event, because you were there. You experienced the magic of C.S. Lewis's home city.
And I mean, I was also like, I laughed whenever you were like, oh, if you're under 30, leave. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm 21 now, Peter. I can stay, I swear.
I know. Well, you're one of the exceptions to the rule.
I find myself very taken, almost stuck in a good way, back in the story, the C.S. Lewis story, reflecting on Anne and Robin and the painter, and where I am in my life, and then listening to your talk about those 3 people. I was walking with my sister last evening, and she's Anne, and I'm very definitely Robin in the seeker way. Luckily, I didn't have Robin's experience where I'm going to go off the cliff, but I go towards painters all the time who promise if you lift up this layer, Mary Beth, here's some answers. Yeah. Or if you lift up this layer, here will be insight. And I'm constantly dissatisfied. Well, it always ends up coming to some kind of dissatisfaction. It's like, that's not it yet. That's not it yet. It's like, I love that story of looking for the light. And then when you talked about the rebel enjoying the struggle for the vision, I thought, oh my God, is that what I'm doing? Am I enjoying this struggle? When I say, I just want to see the light. I want God to open up a sense of call. So I'm very taken by that story and this conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you reminded me of a very close friend of mine, and she's like yourself. Like, she's very aware. She says she's like she really finds herself drawn to anyone who kind of seems to have the answer, whether it's in, you know, sacred or secular forms. But she's very aware of it, and it's very funny talking to her because she kind of goes like, "I've just got into this new thing, right?" And she'll talk about it, and then but a few months later, you know, it'll run aground. But then, yeah, I see you nodding your head. But like yourself, she's going like, "Oh, but actually, it's almost like it's not changing anything except for one's perspective," and going, "Oh, actually, the enjoyment is in the movement itself, not in the solution at the end of the journey, but in the kind of like that, like the dissatisfaction is satisfying." We've just been doing a book study exploring this on Patreon, but the ultimate kind of message of the book is weirdly that the actually struggle and dissatisfaction is the most satisfying thing ever. Like, if you ever were on, like, the most beautiful thing about this story, which is very on C.S. Lewis, because it almost sounds like Jean-Paul Sartre would have written this or something, right? Because the kind of ultimate conclusion of the story is, if you get the thing, if you kind of got to the end, it's a type of death. It kind of leads to a type of death. So yeah, there's a parable I used to tell. I'll just tell you. It's a parable. It's kind of like, I use the audience, so I pretend that they're the audience are making it up. So I go like, there was once somebody called, and then someone shouts out a name, and then I play around with it. But I tell this journey about someone who is constantly searching for the answer. And I kind of go, so first they tried this religion. I go, what was that religion they tried? And somebody shouts something out like making balloon animals or whatever. And so it's kind of funny all the way through. And then at the end, the idea is that this person eventually finds someone who says the very thing of, you know, it is actually your heartfelt pursuit for the truth that is evidence that you're already grasped by the truth. You know, what you're seeking is found. The evidence of the finding is the seeking itself. That's quite that's kind of the punchline.
That's what I think we're invited to in a Christian, well, in most religions, like just a contemplative form of participation. So, you know, that's, I think, just honestly, like being enclosed in quarantine for so long, like, has forced me to sort of reckon with a practice that is fruitful, not as sort of a capstone, like I've got it, but like just to engage with the grit of, you know, like you say, the struggle of prayer, I think is becomes so important to me. Resting in the struggle of prayer, anyway.
Amen to that. Yes, that's the dialectic. It's that the struggle, the chaos is where you find peace. The struggle is where you find some sort of fulfillment. The movement is where you find some sort of stability. And again, that's all this kind of dialectic experience. But as human beings, we try to avoid it because anxiety is really the name for the discontent of living in that space. Today in the modern world, we're often told to get rid of our anxiety. We're helped to get rid of our anxiety, maybe through drugs or through therapy. And to some extent, we need that because sometimes our anxiety is through the roof. But someone like Søren Kierkegaard, he said that actually your anxiety is the evidence of your freedom. And it's the evidence that, so it's the evidence of your freedom, because anxiety is, I don't really know what I should do. I don't know what's expected of me. I don't know who I am. So there's a certain struggle. And Kierkegaard says that that's what being human is. A dog knows what it's like to be a dog. A cat knows what it's like to be a cat. A cat never hangs around and says, well, how should I be a cat? A rock knows how to be a rock. But a human being is someone who constantly says, what is a human being? Right? Well, you don't say something is indoggish, but you say someone is being inhumane or unhuman. So Kierkegaard says that struggle is actually evidence of what it is to be human, but you can find peace within it, within that struggle. And for Kierkegaard, that's the essence of faith, is finding this rest within that.
Yeah, that makes me think, of one of my favorite films, The Shawshank Redemption. At the very end of that film, when Morgan Freeman is out of jail and free, he's in a bus, and his line is, I feel, he says like, oh, I find that I can't sit still or hold a thought in my head. It's, and that's only a feeling a free man can feel. And I love that. Yeah.
Oh, I love that movie. I forgot that line. That's, beautiful. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also wanted to say that, that like, when we're searching for things, I mean, like, we all experience this, and I know that they have been able to observe this in physics too. Like, as soon as we get close to what we think is the answer, it moves away. Yeah. So like, that happens in our experience, but I've heard though, in physics, they're actually able to see how, like, when they get to a certain place and they think they have something, it shifts and it moves away, and I guess that you could sort of conclude that it just means that we always have to be aware, we always have to be conscious in, and in relationship with God, or because as soon as we think we have the answer, we're likely to just like unplug and like not think that we need God and go off on our own.
Yes. Absolutely. I love what you're saying about within kind of the hard sciences, that we see elements of this dialectic structure, because this is the beautiful thing. Like, people often think religion's very out of date, or religion's kind of primitive thinking or whatever. But Hegel, who's one of the greatest philosophers he ever lived, he kind of goes like, oh wow, Christianity got there before everyone else, right? Like, so in other words, what you notice in the 17th to the 20th century is this idea of contradiction entering into science. So for example, evolution is the name for contradiction in biological reality. The contradiction within biological reality creates such diversity within the biological realm. Within politics got there very early too. It's democracy. Democracy is a type of contradiction within social reality, right? Different people with contradictory desires and interests coming together to create a society that's actually stable and can progress. In psychoanalysis, it's called the unconscious, which is the contradiction of subjectivity that creates language and desire. And then in physics, the wave particle duality, the idea of a type of contradiction within the very nature of reality itself that holds everything together. So you could say that the logic of incarnation echoes in all of these kind of hard sciences, that you see this logic of incarnation at work.
If I could offer just a quick thought about like the grappling with, I'm going to call it like the dyslogic of incarnation, in the sense that even within dialectics, right, you have to, in a sense, feel the weight of this contradiction. It's like, this is why you call it the monstrosity, right, of the incarnate Christ. And I was actually thinking about Jacques Derrida, like in The Gift of Death, and he's not a dialectical thinker, right, so much, but he talks about with the incarnation, right, he wants to move away from this understanding that I think is fairly common, right, of this kind of like pure absolute spirit, right, that enters into the finite, into the incarnate, but like on its way back to the spirit, right? So it's kind of like this circular move where it's just like God has to become man, he has to become incarnate, right, in this human form, but it's like he's only kind of doing that so that it's like part of this circular move to return back to himself, to this pure spirit, right? And so Derrida says, no, like the incarnation is this monstrous rupture. It is like this excess, right, out of this spirit, right? It is like the infinite, it's this total radical otherness within the infinite, right, that cannot be resolved back to the infinite spirit, right? And so I know like this again isn't totally dialectical, but I think like it is important to, in a sense, like grapple with the monstrosity, right, to really to think through what it means for the absolute, right, to be reduced in this radical way. So it's like, okay, coming to terms with the radicality of this notion, right, and how it is totally destabilizing. So
yeah, 100%. I mean, and to be honest, like we're only going to touch on the monstrosity because when you think about it, you could almost say that the confessional church has been afraid to a greater or lesser extents to go into the implications of what this incarnational logic means. That doesn't mean but it's kind of crazy because it does break with the notion of God that we all have, that God is the ultimate, doesn't die, doesn't change, doesn't all this. And suddenly if you have this idea of God incarnate, how does that radically transform our notions of the absolute or God? Now we are going to touch on that, but my goodness, it's monstrous is the right word because it challenges everything. Yeah.
I was going to say, back to Cameron in physics, I think another thing that happens is we hopefully change our definition of having. So, what do we know? We used to think of it as atoms, that was very precise, but now it's getting a lot less precise. So I think we're kind of just like moving up a level, right? So it's no longer God, now it's a grounded being. So I think the definition of having has changed. It's not so much I'm looking at this atom, oops, and it shifted over there. I think we're saying no, seeing an atom or this or that aspect of humanity. It's a different way of knowing or having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm following you. Somebody else was going to jump in there.
I was just going to say, he had just mentioned ground of being, which to me gets back to the whole of the C.S. Lewis writing. I've been thinking about the most significant thing, at least to me, was the concept of light. He's looking for light, which is analogous to God, but he's looking for it in the world. And of course, you're not going to see light in the world. You see the things that light illuminates. And so obviously the analogy to God is that God is not going to be showing up in the world, but he's the ground of being. We couldn't have our experiences or see anything without that. And if one accepts that kind of a panentheism or pantheism view, it transforms the mundane into everything becomes sacred, mm-hmm. which then enriches life. So it's the same story of what you're saying about love being that thing that enriches life. So it connects full circle.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add in, it very much reminds me of that documentary. It's kind of funny, like kind of made me laugh. It's called The Secret a little bit. Like the story, for some reason, reminded me of that. Like, once we find out the secret, then we'll somehow be relieved of our suffering. And it's like, then you add on another layer and it's like you never really get there, but you keep, hopefully you keep moving yourself forward in, some way, shape, or form. And what always reminds me about the holidays and with thinking about this story is like, there's part of me that wants to listen to pentatonics for 4 or 5 hours. And then there's the other part of me that's kind of being brought back to, some painful memories that came up over the holiday years ago. So you're kind of holding that space kind of in between those two spaces really during this time.
Yes. No, absolutely. And like this is, I remember a Star Trek episode way back in the originals where I think this God type creature can take all the suffering away from all the people on the spaceship, and they all do it except for James T. Kirk. And but he kind of sees that something about his suffering and his pain and those things make him who he is, and he has to kind of dwell with them to some extent rather than try to get to a space in which one is free from them all. But I don't know why it reminded me of that. Also, just with Troy, C.S. Lewis has this beautiful analogy of God as Shakespeare in terms of play. Says you'll never find Shakespeare in Hamlet, but Shakespeare is everywhere in Hamlet. So C.S. Lewis followed the philosopher George Berkeley, who was an Irish philosopher, who believed that everything was kind of in the mind of God. But it's an interesting thing where you go, oh yeah, you'll never find Hamlet in Shakespeare, but yet Shakespeare kind of is everywhere in Hamlet. Just like you'll never find yourself in your dream, but actually your dream tells me lots about you. It's all about you, but yet you're rarely in your dream. So yeah, and the radical thing is then C.S. Lewis says, but then the idea of Christianity is then Shakespeare writes himself into the play. And this brings us to what Kyle's talking about, which is, I don't think C.S. Lewis went to the radicality of what that means, but it's a really interesting thing of what does it mean if you think of the absolute as within the world. So anyway, we've just got another 10 minutes or so. Does anybody want to jump in?
I have a little something that's interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over somebody.
Go for it.
Okay, well, it just hit me because we're talking about an Advent of contradictions, and of course, the word Advent has to do with waiting, and that's from the Latin, and then from the Greek, it's parousia, which means presence or arrival. So even within the tradition of Advent itself, there is a verbalized contradiction that I never really picked up on until just now. But yeah, go ahead.
No, that's very good. I'm just pointing because I'm going like, that's very good. I wish I'd thought of that.
Oh, well, feel free, put it in wherever you like.
Yeah, I'm going to pretend that that's the whole reason why we're doing this, because you're right, yeah, because Advent has those two meanings, which is an expectation and also a presence. Very good. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about that? Because I just wanted to interrupt you to say I liked it. But...
Well, I mean, how do you put that into place in your own life? What kind of practice? I mean, if you see my name is Uriel CMJ. That's my professed name. My life in religious, my name is Uriel. My name in not religious life is Gregory. My community is called the Community of the Mother of Jesus. So I have very specific practices in my life that don't have anything to do with my own subjectivity and everything to do with just plugged in to receive tradition. But I'm wondering, what are people doing to rupture the traditional and really break through into what Advent could possibly bring?
Yeah.
And, or even being aware of how that might be disappointing, and that's good, so I'm interested in all of that.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question on that note. Peter, I loved what you said about in your beginning talk about justice. That when you fail to find justice, that's how you know you're doing justice. I wonder if you could say something along those lines about community, because I know so many of my favorite writers do exactly that. If it's Jean-Luc Nancy or Blanchot, and I'm really interested in going deeper into that kind of what he was saying, Gregory was saying about the failures and the application.
Yeah. I'll say one thing, and I'd love to kind of hear some more of your thoughts on that. But connected with what Uriel, if I'm saying it correctly, was saying, is in relation to the book study that some of you are doing, and Kate and various people are doing. There's the logic of always seeking the end of anxiety, the end of struggle, seeking the thing that will answer it. So one commodity to another, we're always moving forward. This type of thinking, the dialectic thinking, should bring you into a place where you're part of a community in which you're not looking for the satisfaction of the anxiety. You're broken free from this frenetic pursuit. So that's why, you know, someone like Zizek, and I've used this, I've kind of adapted it from Zizek, but I'll say, you know, it's great to have freedom to pursue what will make you happy, but we need freedom from the pursuit of what will make us happy as well. And that's kind of what church is. It's this desert in the oasis, a place where we are disinvested from this frenetic pursuit of the answer. You know, like Mary Beth was talking about, that pursuit that kind of, you think it's going to satisfy the anxiety, but it generates anxiety, and somehow enjoying the literal not having. But so that's the type of community that I'm trying to create with paratheology. But is that connected with what you're talking about, Jaime, or do you want to, or is that going a different direction?
Yeah, no, that's I like that. And I think you said that next week you're going to be talking about, today you spoke about truth, and next week will be about desire. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of going there already, and I really like that. But yeah, you know, I'm continually puzzled by this idea that the place, I don't remember the exact quote, but you know, the community is defined by when we begin at the place where community is impossible, and acknowledging that, mm-hmm. That's community. And yeah, I'm continually confounded by that.
Yes. I remember even practically when I did Icon, like I was very careful to say at the beginning that we're not a place where you're going to find a lot of help, and you're not going to find a lot of pastoral care. The only pastoral care you're probably going to get is from the person sitting to the right or to the left of you. And we're kind of like a donut with a hole in the middle. There's no center that provides all of these services. We're kind of all in the circle. But it was a way of, because I realized from my work in community that when you say that you can provide those things, it ends up, you know, you promise too much and deliver too little. But when you kind of say we're a broken community where we're all in this together, you actually indirectly create community. It creates a healthier community. So basically you say community is impossible. Just like as Churchill said, democracy is the worst kind of system until you look at all the rest. Like community, there's a type of impossibility in terms of human relationships. There's a type of messiness, and the only commitment we have is to keep showing up, But I don't know if that connects with your idea. Like the impossibility of community is also the criteria for the possibility of community.
Yeah, and it's that question about commitment, which is so key, and you hit it. You know, so what should we do to encourage or to ensure that the others, or even myself, will commit to coming back? Yeah. You know, yeah. Whatever we do, it's going to defeat the purpose.
Yeah, a friend of mine, he's a psychoanalyst and does group psychoanalysis. He says the only rule of his group, sometimes they make rules together, just very basic ones. And by the way, when they make rules, they're rules that are not meant to be broken, but when they're broken, they're just used as a way of asking, why did you break it? So it's to find out why the person did. But the only really rule there is no matter how much someone annoys you or how much you want to leave, try to stay committed to the group. So like in analysis, you can shout at your analyst, you can scream at them, you can say like, you're only doing this for the money, you don't care about me, I hate you. And at the end, it's like, see you next Tuesday. It's like that's the container. It's like that no matter how much we all fight, we're all like, all right, see you next week. So yeah.
I hope I heard that he's going to come and speak with us. I'm looking forward to that. Your friend, the analyst.
Oh yes. I'll actually. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll follow up with that. Yeah, that would be good. In the last couple of minutes, anybody want to jump in?
So I have
Tim. Oh, was that?
I was just gonna throw in a real quick funny thought that this community idea. If we could have a community full of Robins instead of Anns, that would really help too. Mm-hmm. Because I think churches are full of Anns. And the Robins who come forward to seek out the deeper truths are found themselves surrounded by people who really aren't thinking those bigger thoughts. So I would welcome to be a part of a community where everybody's name is Robin.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and the trick of parotheology, what I'm trying to do is all of us, we're all guilty. This is the reason why someone goes to psychoanalysis is because they think the analyst can help them, right? If you didn't think that, you'd never go. And then over time, the analyst kind of reveals that not only can they not help you, you're doing all the work, right? They're just asking some questions and you're doing all of the work. And actually, you know, they can't bring back that person that you lost or anything like that, but they can help you bear the weight of life. So what you discover is you want them to be the answer. They reveal that they're not the answer, and that is the answer. And that's the cure of psychoanalysis is you go to them, they're the answer. But instead of the analyst saying, yes, I'll give you what you want, I'll make you whole and complete, the analyst very gradually disillusions you, makes you go like, oh, life is struggle and there's going to be painful things in my life and things are going to go wrong. So this is not the answer. And then you walk away and you go, I can bear the weight of that. That is the answer. That's beautiful. And so my issue with a lot of churches is someone goes into a church because they're feeling something. They want the painter. They want the painter to say, here's the answer. And the pastor pretends to give the answer because they even feel they have to. They feel that's what they're getting paid to do. Whereas the temptation the pastor has to resist, just like Lacan says, the temptation the analyst has to resist is to give the patient what they want. You have to resist giving them what they want, which is, I want the answer, I want satisfaction, I want to get rid of my anxiety, so as to help them. The pastor has to refuse to give the congregation what they want, a God who will give them the answer, who'll fix everything, make everything wonderful. But by refusing to do that, they help create a community of Robins, exactly what you're talking about, but satisfied Robins. The problem with Robin is he wasn't satisfied by his dissatisfaction. And if he'd met a painter who actually didn't say, I've got the answer, but rather, you've already got the answer. See this heartfelt searching you're doing that's bringing you into nature and you're walking around and you're up in this quarry. That is the answer. Then we would have a satisfied, dissatisfied Robin. And that's what parotheology is attempting to do is, as you say, create lots of Robins who are freed from the temptation to find the guru. That's why I talk about the last guru. We all need gurus, but the best guru is the one who reveals they're not a guru. So you realize that they helped you realize they can't help you and that you can bear the weight of your own existential life. And that's the cure.
But so then how do you have that? The psychoanalysis suddenly, like the cure is eventually not showing up. But we just talked about community is about continually showing up.
Yes, that's great. We've talked about this before, actually. This is great because this comes to a tension that I have in my work. And you got me started, but I'll finish with this and then we'll go to happy hour. There's a part of me that goes, what would it look like to have churches that were temporary, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year churches where you undergo this experience and then you leave and you have community and friendship, but it's temporary. But I'm also struggles with the idea of one of the beautiful things about a church is you commit for all of your life and you go and you hang out. You don't go every week necessarily, but it's part of the rhythm of your life from birth to death. And so you're just bringing up a really good question about what's something like, because I did set up a couple of 1 year communities as an experiment. So one thing I would say, Lacan says this, is once you've undergone the cure, then you've got two choices. You either go about your life or you commit to helping others do it as well. And so you could have a type of community where you go for a few years. Hopefully it brings you into this experience. And then you can either just keep going to remain faithful to it, or you can give yourself into helping that community help others, or you might leave. It's like you've almost got three choices. I don't know. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's interesting that contradiction is an interesting one.
Yeah. Because for me, like, as you know, there is a purpose, like not just community, You know, you can get community anywhere, right? It's not just community, it's undergoing the cure, the what salvation in religion, but the cure in psychoanalysis is undergoing this experience of finding the absolute in the struggle of life, the epoch of the Holy Ghost, finding meaning in the embrace of love. And once you've experienced that, that's like, then you kind of are faithful to it. But that's kind of the purpose for me of the parotheological liturgy, is to get you to that experience. But I want to finish up there because we've got, this week anyway, we've got the happy hour. Next week, I don't think we do, so we may go a little bit later, I'm not sure. Maybe we are having it. Kate, are we having happy hour each week? We could
can do if people want to. I mean, people are very welcome to come as much as they want. We've also got Coffee and Concepts tomorrow for anyone who wants to talk about this kind of stuff further. We're going to be talking about contradiction, so looking at kind of the enjoyment and contemplation and the practical theory, head versus heart, all of that kind of stuff, and discussing that in a bit more detail. So that is 11 a.m. Monday morning, depending on time zones. It could be tomorrow, it could be, well, several days away for all I know with time zones at the moment. But if we've also got the Google Calendar with all the events that we've got going on. So if you're not logged into that, then there is the various Patreon post with the Google Calendar link. Any problems, let me know. Yeah, I wanted to talk about Coffee Concepts, Google Calendar, and happy hour going on now. We can talk about it in happy hour, but if people want to do it next week, in the third week, on the 13th of December, we have Off the Rails with the amazing Tim, where we basically talk about all things theological, and we talk about kind of just blowing up the whole system and what it looks like if we go completely insane. And refuse to follow any of the rules that we used to. So that's a really good place as well.
Yeah, it's amazing what's going on now. I can't believe there's so much happening. It's brilliant. Thank you. All right. So it's also so lovely to get to know some of you in a virtual way. Some of you I know in person, most of you virtually, but I starting to feel like we're becoming more and more of a community, and I don't know what that's going to look like over the next year or two, but I'm excited about what that might look like. So thank you so much for being part of this, for being part of this Advent course, and I'll see you all next week. Bye bye.